Despite being the father of the nation, George Washington was physically unable to father any of his own children. This was likely due to him contracting smallpox when he was just a young boy in his teenage years, for fact. It also could be due to getting his case of tuberculosis around the same time. In order to fulfill his want for fatherhood, he married someone who had two children, in effect became his step children. One of these stepchildren connects directly to the family line of Robert E. Lee. During the Revolutionary War, John Adams, the second President of the United States, was known to be one who cared for freedom. He loved freedom. However, somehow, one of the first things he did in office was sign the Alien and Sedition Acts, making it illegal to criticize the government of the United States of America. For someone who defended British soldiers while he didn't agree with them because he believed they deserved a fair trial, it seemed shocking that he would sign such a law. Thomas Jefferson was known to be a needy man. In fact, he was so needy that he had sexual relations with one of his slaves when she was as young as 14. The girl's name was Sally Hemings, and Jefferson continued to have sexual relations with her all throughout his entire life. However, Sally Hemings wasn't even that black. She was only 1/8 black, because she was the half sister of Thomas Jefferson's late wife, Martha Jefferson. President James Madison was one of the most influential and key figures of the Democratic Republican Party. The Democratic Republican Party was in opposition to the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party, in its conception, was the party that supported the ratification of the Constitution. The Constitution that James Madison himself wrote. This contradiction was noted while he was in office, as he started to act more like a Federalist than a Democratic Republican. Only 4 years before James Madison would leave office would the Federalist unofficially cease to exist. By most accounts today, the average American probably doesn't know too much about 5th President James Monroe. However, that's a shame, as President Monroe was very influential in the creation of the United States as we know it so far. In 1823, over 200 years ago, President Monroe spoke into the world the Monroe Doctrine, claiming that if Europe did not interfere with the Americas, the United States would not interfere with the European affairs. Most of that Monroe Doctrine, however, was not written by James Monroe. In fact, none of it was. All of the Monroe Doctrine was written by his Secretary of State and presidential successor, John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams also spoke over 8 languages, 4 of them fluently and 4 of them proficiently. By all accounts, he was probably the smartest man to have ever assumed the office of President of the United States of America. 7th President Andrew Jackson was known to be someone who didn't really seem to care all too much about the Native Americans. In his time in office, one of the most influential and notorious things that Jackson did was sign into law the Indian Removal Act, which set into motion the Trail of Tears, which sent all of the native Cherokee from their lands in Georgia to Oklahoma instead. However, as he was unable to have children as well, he had 2 adopted young boys who were both of First Nation descent. The United States of America does not officially have a official language of the country recognized by the United States Congress. Therefore, it is more than possible for someone who does not speak English as their primary language to rise to the top as president. And I say this because it's already happened. eighth president, Martin Van Buren, did not speak English as his first language. His first language was Dutch, evident by his last name. He lived in Kinderhook, New York for most of his life, and that town, even today, is still filled with Dutch people. The shortest serving president in American history goes by the name William Henry Harrison. He took office on the 4th of March, 1841, on a cold and drizzly day, without wearing a coat or any type of protection that might heal him and conceal him from pneumonia. 3 weeks later, he caught pneumonia and died on the 4th of April, 1841. However, most experts agree that it was not wearing a coat in the hot and the cold weather that killed him. It was actually drinking the DC water, which was noted for being infected with disgusting stuff. 10th President John Tyler was also quite a needy man. He also had a lot of sexual relations with his slaves. All in all, he had over 15 children, the most out of any American president in history. He had one of his sons as late as the 1850s, who continued to have his kids as late as the 1920s. One of those kids, born in the 1920s, only died in May 2025. While William Henry Harrison is known to have had the shortest presidency in American history, the shortest post-presidency in American history belongs to one James Knox Polk. He served for one full term between 1845 and 1849, fulfilling his promise to not run again for re-election in the 1848 election. He died on the 15th of June, 1849, having left office on March the 4th. James Polk was known to be a workaholic and drank probably the water from Washington, D.C., which, just like Harrison, almost certainly resulted in his death as well. At the time that he became President of the United States, Zachary Taylor was an old man. He was only 4 years younger than Harrison had been when he took office. Taylor was around the age of 64 years old when nominated by the Whig Party to become president. If there was one thing that Zachary Taylor did not care about, it was politics. He was a lifelong military man, and that's the only thing he cared about. He had not voted in a single election until the year 1846. He voted, of course, in 1848 and became president, even though he did not know his name was on the ballot until the election campaign had already started. Millard Fillmore did a lot in office as President of the United States 10 years before the Civil War broke out. He signed the Fugitive Slave Law, reinforcing what had already been in the Constitution, making enslaved slaves from the South go into the Northern Territories, but if they were to do so, they were to be returned back to their owners in the South. This was a harmful policy for national unity and, of course, caused the Civil War. However, most people today don't know Millard Fillmore, as he is the least remembered president in American history. While it is an undisputable fact that the U.S. Civil War as we know it began in Fort Sumter, South Carolina in the year 1860, some historians like to argue that the Civil War actually started 6 years before, on May the 31st, 1854, in Kansas. The day before that, President at that time, Franklin Pierce, signed into law the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide if they wanted to have slavery legal or illegal in that area once it became a state. That, of course, led to a mad rush of both pro and anti slavery advocates to Kansas, which led to bloodshed. That is why a lot of historians will argue the Civil War actually began in Kansas in 1854. 15th President James Buchanan is the only president to be a lifelong bachelor. President Buchanan didn't marry a woman in his entire life. However, he was engaged to a woman who later broke off the engagement before mysteriously drowning a couple days later. James Buchanan is said that he could have possibly, may have been, gay because he lived with another man at that time, William Rufus King, who was also a lifelong bachelor. Despite Abraham Lincoln living the grand majority of his life in the Midwestern states, he seemed to have a fine taste for the Eastern Seaboard's food. His favorite food in the entire world was oysters. Alaska was the 49th state to join the Union in 1959. However, the state of Alaska was purchased from the Empire of Russia all the way back in January 1867. It was bought by then President Andrew Johnson. However, it wasn't initially offered to Johnson. The Russian Empire offered the massive territory to the small European landlocked nation of Liechtenstein because the Emperor of Russia and the King of Liechtenstein were close friends. 18th President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, was not only a famed general before becoming president, but was also the first president to run into significant issues with the law. He was arrested while he served as president for speeding on his horse. He was then taken down by a police officer who said, "I'm sorry, Mr. President, but I've got to ask you to pay a fine." The fine was the very hefty price of $20. The president that won the election by the shortest amount of electoral votes in American history goes to Rutherford B. Hayes. While the 1824 and 2000 elections were pretty close, the 1876 election saw the Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes barely edge out the Democratic candidate Samuel J. Tilden. This happened after 20 electoral votes were disputed in states such as Oregon, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. However, a court ruled that all 20 of those electoral votes would go to the Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes, giving him the win with 186 electoral votes, with Tilden getting 185. John Quincy Adams might be regarded as the smartest president to ever take the office of United States President. However, he definitely has a significant run for his money by the 20th president, James Abraham Garfield. President Garfield was so smart, he was reported as writing Latin in his left hand and Greek in his right hand at the same time. President Chester Arthur is the head of many debates about where he was actually born. The United States Constitution declares that anyone who wants to become the United States President must have been born an American citizen. Chester Arthur was, because he was born in Fairfield, Vermont. However, some of his opponents and allies, but maybe that's a topic for a different video, tried to declare that he was born in Ireland or in Canada, making him ineligible to be an American citizen, and thus ineligible for the vice presidency and, following Garfield's assassination, the presidency. Following James Buchanan, Grover Cleveland was the only other president to enter as a bachelor. However, just the next year, he would get married to a woman named Frances Folsom. Folsom was the daughter of one of Grover Cleveland's longtime friends. It's often reported that after Grover Cleveland left office in 1889, Folsom said to one of the White House staff, "Leave everything as it is, for we will be back in 4 years." And she was right, even though Grover Cleveland was initially content on just leaving politics. When electricity started to become more of a common use, Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of William Henry Harrison, was the President of the United States. Harrison, however, born in 1833, was terrified of electricity and getting electrocuted. While he was the first president to live in a White House with lights powered by electricity, he would often go to sleep with the lights on as he was petrified of shutting them off due to the fear that he might get electrocuted and pass away on the job. President William McKinley was the third ever president in American history, following Abraham Lincoln and James A. Garfield, to have been assassinated while serving as President of the United States. This was at the time where there was mass industry and producing more and more inventions. It's because of this, McKinley was the very first president to ride in a car, which, at that point, was serving as more of an impromptu ambulance because he was driven right to the hospital to get treated for his wounds. The assassination of McKinley would lead to Vice President Theodore Roosevelt becoming President of the United States, aged 42, the youngest in American history. However, in 1912, after Theodore Roosevelt had already left office, he was running for a third term when, in Milwaukee, he was giving a campaign speech where one of the crowd members said that he was visited by McKinley's ghost in a dream. McKinley's ghost claimed that Roosevelt had ordered the assassination of McKinley in order to graduate from vice presidency to presidency. He was shot in the chest by this man. However, Roosevelt survived after the bullet pierced through his glasses cases and a folded up copy of his speech. That speech Roosevelt would later give to entirety for an hour and a half before assuming medical help. He knew he was okay because when he was coughing, he didn't cough up any blood, so he knew it didn't penetrate his heart. The second time in American presidential history that the United States president ever left America was when in 1912 President William Howard Taft left the United States and headed to Mexico to meet with their then president, Porfirio Diaz. It was the first time that an American and Mexican president ever met together, in what was once again only the second time that the president ever left the White House. By all accounts, Woodrow Wilson's victory in the 1912 presidential election was revolutionary. The Republican Party split into the Progressives, led by Theodore Roosevelt, and the Conservatives, led by William Howard Taft. This led to an easy victory by the Democrats, winning over 400 electoral votes. It was only the second time since the end of the Civil War that a Democrat had won the White House, following Grover Cleveland's non-consecutive times in the 1880s and 1890s. It was also the first time that a president representing a southern state, in the case of Virginia, got elected since before the Civil War, with Zachary Taylor representing Kentucky. 29th President Warren Gamaliel Harding was known to not be a great president, nor a great guy. He was alleged and later proven to have had many, many affairs while as a senator and even as President of the United States, the most famous of which was with a lady named Nan Britton, who alleged that Harding had a daughter with her. Harding denied the claim. However, DNA testing later proved Britain was right. Harding had in fact had a daughter with her. In 1826, 50 years after the founding of the United States, the Declaration of Independence, its writer, Thomas Jefferson, and his predecessor, John Adams, passed away on the same day. 5 years later, James Monroe, who was also a very influential founding father, passed away. Three presidents passed away on the 4th of July in just 5 years. However, only one president was born on the 4th of July, that being John Calvin Coolidge, the 30th President of the United States. 31st President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, is most remembered for being the president at the start of the Great Depression. However, that is so depressing to hear. Hoover should not be remembered for the failure, the one failure he had in his entire life. He should be remembered for his successes. You might be asking, what successes could a man like Hoover possibly have? Well, does feeding over 1 million hungry, war-stricken children in Belgium and the rest of war-torn Europe count as a good thing? Because I think it does. Herbert Hoover should be remembered as a hero, not as a villain. Franklin Roosevelt was known for being an incredible leader during World War II, and honestly, nobody can strip him of that. However, something that he really liked to do, more than lead the war needy country, was look at stamps. Roosevelt was an avid stamp collector and would review all of his stamps that he'd collected every single night before he went to bed. Franklin Roosevelt also kicked into motion the Manhattan Project. This project would be what eventually led to the creation and the dropping of nuclear weapons. This was a very important project, as no other country in the entire history of the world had developed nuclear bombs yet. This made Roosevelt want to keep the operation as quiet, secretive, and unknown as humanly possible. This meant to not tell as much people as possible. One of the people that he did not tell about the Manhattan Project was his own vice president and successor, Harry S. Truman. Dwight David Eisenhower was the 34th President of the United States. However, his name at birth was actually not Dwight David Eisenhower. His name at birth was David Dwight Eisenhower, named after his father to a T. The confusion and swapping of his first and middle name comes from his own mother, who would often differentiate between the two by calling David Sr. David and Dwight Dwight. At age 18, Eisenhower got it officialized. In the year 1962, the world almost came to a complete stop. This was because President John F. Kennedy and the USSR leader Nikita Khrushchev were involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, the American president's handling of it was largely the main reason why the world did not go up in nuclear radiation. We all have to owe our lives to President John F. Kennedy. However, of course, the public didn't his office didn't want the public to panic nor know what was really going on. So, in order to keep the public from panicking, the reason why John F. Kennedy wasn't going out of his office much was officially because he had a cold. There were two main frontrunners in the 1960 Democratic National Convention to become the nominee for the Democratic Party for president, those being the previously mentioned John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson was not the favorite to win. It was actually Kennedy, because his father had a lot of money and was very successful and powerful within the nation. Of course, Kennedy won the nomination, leaving Johnson to be vice president. However, this made Johnson very mad and upset with Kennedy and the DNC. He believed that Kennedy only got what he wanted because he was a spoiled rich kid, piggying off of his rich father. This led to many people believe, once Kennedy got assassinated on the 22nd of November 1963, that President Johnson had something to do with it. And it's not a theory, not based in reality. In 1972, Richard Nixon, the incumbent president, and his Republican Party won that year's election big. They won over 500 electoral votes for only the second time in American history. This filled Nixon with a lot of confidence. However, what he fully knew at the time was that the election wasn't the fairest. A couple of men broke into the Democratic National Convention Watergate Hotel and leaked some of that information to the president. It was not very, sportsmanship like. Nixon eventually had to resign on the 9th of August, 1974, being the only president to do so in American history as of 2025. While becoming president isn't exactly where everybody expects to end up one day, it was truly, truly unexpected for Gerald Ford, the football player who, after graduating from the University of Michigan, rejected both the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers to pursue a career in law. He was appointed Vice President of the United States by none other than Richard Nixon following the resignation of Spiro Agnew. Following Nixon's resignation, an unprompted resignation, or prompted but unconventional, Ford took the office of President of the United States. As of July 2025, President Jimmy Carter is the first and only president to live to 100 years of age, the first centenarian president in history. He's also the most recent president to die as of narrating this, following his death on the 29th of December 2024. At the time of becoming president, Ronald Reagan was the first president to be a significant celebrity, being a pretty well-known actor in the television and entertainment sphere. He was also the first president to have previously been divorced before remarrying to Nancy Reagan. He's not the only president to do this, nor the first one either, because both Donald Trump did both of those things, as he was a famous celebrity before becoming president of the United States, and he was also divorced twice. George H.W. Bush, George Bush Sr., he was a very, very interesting figure. He was definitely showing his human side a lot while in office. The press had a field day whenever they asked him about his least favorite vegetable, broccoli. George H.W. Bush absolutely hated broccoli and would never have it served to him ever. However, he did not ban it from Air Force One. That's a misconception. In 2011, former President Bill Clinton answered some questions about the kids' TV show, My Little Pony and Friends. He answered all of the questions right, 100% accuracy on My Little Pony. He's a brony. However, it's almost on all certainty that he got these because of his daughter Chelsea, who was probably a fan of the show. President George W. Bush is most notorious for being a president focused on nation building other nations. He sent troops to Afghanistan and to Iraq in response to the 9/11 attacks. However, in the 2000 election debate, he wanted to make it clear that he was not focused on nation building other countries. He was focused on internal reform. He was focused on making America better for Americans. However, of course, after 9/11 happens, there's only so much you can do. With the only exception of Jimmy Carter, 6 straight presidents from Gerald Ford to Barack Obama were not right-handed, they were left-handed. Only 2 presidents before Gerald Ford in the 20th century were left-handed, Harry Truman and Herbert Hoover, and James Garfield was the first to be left-handed. However, there were 5 in quick succession, as I just mentioned: Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and of course Barack Obama were all left-handed. Donald Trump was a celebrity. He was actually a very, very famous celebrity before deciding to run for president in 2016. He had run for president before then, most notably in 2000, running for the Reform Party, which flopped very hard. However, in 2016, he ran for the Republican Party and won. He had never served in the military, nor had he served in any political office beforehand. He is the first president to have never served in either a political job or the military in American history. Every single American president has had nicknames, whether they liked it or they didn't, given by their opponents. Joe Biden's most common nickname to poke fun of him from his opponent, former President Donald Trump, is Sleepy Joe. He argues that Joe Biden likes to sleep. And you know what? You should sleep too. Good night, little one. Don't let the bed bugs bite.